Fangs, fear, and fascination. Vampires have haunted our screens for over a century. From Nosferatu's monstrous terror to Twilight's brooding romance, these creatures of the night have evolved with every generation. But how did we get here? How did cinema transform the vampire from a horrifying predator into a seductive, complex antihero? Tonight, we journey through the ages of cinematic vampires, exploring their metamorphosis from nightmare fuel to pop culture icons. Sink your teeth into this deep dive into film history. This is The Cinematic Vampire, from Monstrous to Modern. Hammer horror films, 1950s-70s. In the years following World War II, Hollywood's classic horror cycle, dominated by Universal's Dracula, 1931, Frankenstein, 1931, and The Wolfman, 1941, had faded in popularity. By the 1950s, horror was largely relegated to low-budget science fiction films featuring giant monsters and atomic-age anxieties. Hammer Film Productions, a British studio, saw an opportunity to rejuvenate Gothic horror by reintroducing classic monsters with a modern sensibility. Hammer's approach differed significantly from Universal's black-and-white, atmospheric horrors. The studio utilized Technicolor, crafting visually striking films that emphasized lavish period settings, elaborate costumes, and, most notably, the use of blood-red gore, which was largely absent from previous horror films. This marked a significant shift in the genre, making horror more visceral and immediate. Christopher Lee's reinvention of Dracula. The most significant contribution Hammer made to horror cinema was undoubtedly its reimagining of Dracula, spearheaded by Christopher Lee's commanding presence. When Dracula, 1958, released in the US as Horror of Dracula, hit the screens, it broke away from the traditional image of the vampire as a reserved, mysterious figure. Unlike Bela Lugosi's 1931 portrayal, which emphasized Dracula's hypnotic gaze and old-world charm, Lee's version was a physically imposing and menacing figure. Towering at 6 feet 5 inches, Lee brought a dominating presence to the role, using his deep voice and piercing eyes to project both aristocratic elegance and feral aggression. His Dracula was an intensely physical being, an agile predator rather than a languid, theatrical nobleman. This sense of power and danger, combined with his virile sexuality, made him a compelling and terrifying antagonist. Lee's Dracula was also defined by a pronounced animalistic sensuality. While Universal's Dracula had hinted at a predatory attraction toward women, Lee's portrayal was far more overt. His interactions with female victims were charged with seduction and violence, as he frequently overpowered them with a mixture of hypnotic allure and brute force. This balance of danger and eroticism became one of the defining characteristics of Hammer's Dracula, making him a symbol of both fear and desire. The role of sexuality in Hammer's Dracula films. Hammer's approach to horror was markedly more mature than its predecessors. The studio did not shy away from themes of repressed desire, seduction, and erotic horror, making full use of Britain's loosening censorship laws. The Hammer Dracula series leaned heavily into the inherent sexual undertones of the vampire mythos. Women in the films were often depicted as both victims and willing participants in Dracula's embrace, reinforcing themes of both submission and liberation. Unlike Lugosi's Dracula, who simply exerted a hypnotic influence, Lee's vampire actively pursued his victims, often forcefully biting them in moments that blended violence with intimacy. The exposed necks, heaving bosoms, and breathless expressions of Hammer's heroines made the films highly suggestive. This erotic charge was particularly evident in Dracula, Prince of Darkness, 1966, and Taste the Blood of Dracula, 1970, where the vampire's bite was depicted as an almost orgasmic experience. The contrast between Dracula's victims before and after their transformation into vampires also reinforced this theme. The women he seduced were often portrayed as demure and innocent before falling under his spell. Once bitten, they became uninhibited and sensuous, their newfound sexual energy mirroring Dracula's own potent masculinity. This transformation played into Victorian anxieties about female sexuality and its connection to sin and moral corruption, a theme that Hammer frequently exploited. Violence, horror, and the changing image of Dracula. Christopher Lee's Dracula was not only seductive but also ruthlessly violent. Hammer's films showcased a level of bloodletting that was shocking for its time. The act of vampirism was depicted with an unprecedented level of physicality, throats were torn open, blood splattered, and victims writhed in agony. These moments of explicit horror, combined with the film's sexual themes, pushed the boundaries of the horror genre and contributed to Hammer's international success. Despite this emphasis on brutality, Lee's Dracula retained an aristocratic elegance that made him all the more frightening. He was not a mindless monster but a cunning predator who could navigate high society with ease. His ability to seduce and destroy in equal measure made him a uniquely dangerous villain, one who embodied both sophistication and savagery. Lee's performance evolved over the course of the Hammer Dracula films, often reflecting broader changes in horror cinema. Early films like Dracula, 1958, and Dracula, Prince of Darkness, 1966, adhered to classic Gothic horror conventions. However, as the 1970s approached and horror became more experimental, films like Dracula AD 1972 transported the vampire into contemporary London, attempting to modernize the legend for a new generation. While these later films were met with mixed reviews, they demonstrated Hammer's willingness to adapt and innovate. The legacy of Christopher Lee's Dracula. Christopher Lee's portrayal of Dracula left an indelible mark on both the vampire genre and horror cinema as a whole. His performance influenced countless later portrayals, from Frank Langella's romanticized Dracula, 1979, to Gary Oldman's more tragic figure in Bram Stoker's Dracula, 1992. Lee's combination of sexual magnetism, brute force, and aristocratic menace set the template for modern interpretations of the vampire. Beyond the Dracula series, Hammer's approach to horror, with its emphasis on vivid color, bold performances, and mature themes, helped redefine the genre. The studio paved the way for later horror filmmakers to explore more explicit violence and sexuality, influencing directors such as John Carpenter, Dario Argento, and Guillermo del Toro. Despite Lee's frustrations with the increasingly repetitive scripts of the Hammer Dracula films, his legacy as the definitive cinematic vampire remains intact. His presence looms large over the genre, ensuring that Hammer's bold reinvention of the vampire mythos continues to resonate with audiences decades later. Hammer Horror's Dracula films, spearheaded by Christopher Lee's commanding performance, transformed the vampire legend into something more aggressive, sensual, and visceral than ever before. By infusing the character with a physicality and eroticism previously unseen in horror cinema, Lee redefined Dracula for a modern audience. His portrayal blurred the line between fear and attraction, creating a version of the vampire that was as dangerously seductive as he was terrifying. This reimagining not only reinvigorated the horror genre but also ensured that the legend of Dracula would continue to evolve, captivating generations of viewers to come. Anne Rice's The Vampire Chronicles, 1976 to 2003. Prior to Rice, vampires in literature were largely portrayed as monstrous predators, void of human sentimentality. While figures like Bram Stoker's Dracula, 1897, exhibited intelligence and manipulation, they lacked profound introspection. Rice revolutionized the genre by giving vampires a psychological and emotional depth previously unseen, creating creatures who struggle with their eternal nature and moral dilemmas. Rice's first novel, Interview with the Vampire, 1976, introduced Louis de Pointe du Lac, a vampire recounting his life story to a human interviewer. Louis, unlike traditional vampires, is tormented by guilt over his need to kill to survive. His creator, Lestat de Lioncourt, embodies hedonism and the celebration of vampiric nature, forming a compelling dichotomy between indulgence and restraint. This novel established the themes that would permeate the entire series: moral ambiguity, the nature of evil, and the burden of immortality. The evolution of the vampire archetype. Rice's vampires are not just predators but deeply introspective beings who wrestle with their place in the world. Her portrayal reshaped vampire fiction by introducing the following characteristics. Psychological complexity. Unlike their folkloric predecessors, Rice's vampires possess intricate thoughts, emotions, and desires. They are capable of love, sorrow, jealousy, and existential dread. Moral dilemmas. They struggle with the ethics of their existence. Louis, in particular, is plagued by remorse for killing humans, while others, like Lestat, eventually ponder the implications of their actions. Romanticism and sensuality. Her vampires experience deep emotional connections that transcend human sexuality, forming complex and often homoerotic relationships. Existential crisis. Many characters question their purpose, grappling with the implications of eternal life and the absence of a clear moral framework. Rice's characters are not merely static figures but evolve over time, reflecting different philosophical viewpoints. Lewis represents existential despair, while Lestat, who starts as an almost villainous figure, gradually transforms into a protagonist embracing his nature, seeking knowledge and redefining vampiric identity. Key themes and philosophical underpinnings. 1. Existentialism and the search for meaning. Rice's vampires often struggle with existentialist concerns reminiscent of Jean-Paul Sartre and Friedrich Nietzsche's philosophies. In Interview with a Vampire, Lewis continuously questions whether immortality is a gift or a curse, struggling with the realization that there is no divine justice to govern his actions. His journey is emblematic of the human quest for meaning in an indifferent universe. Lestat, on the other hand, embraces his existence, mirroring Nietzsche's Übermensch concept, the idea of a being who creates their own values rather than adhering to imposed moralities. As the series progresses, Lestat seeks to redefine vampiric purpose, oscillating between nihilism and self-actualization. 2. The nature of good and evil. Unlike the binary moral structures of earlier vampire fiction, the Vampire Chronicles presents morality as subjective. The vampire's predatory nature forces them to constantly redefine good and evil based on their unique perspectives. In The Vampire Lestat, 1985, Lestat narrates his own transformation from a reluctant vampire to an individual who fully embraces his identity, challenging Lewis's view of vampirism as inherently evil. Later books, such as The Tale of the Body Thief, 1992, and Memnoch the Devil, 1995, deepen these explorations, with Lestat even encountering God and the devil, questioning divine will and cosmic morality. Rice's vampires navigate a moral landscape where conventional human ethics do not apply, forcing them to construct their own ethical codes. 3. The pain of immortality. Unlike traditional vampires who relish eternity, Rice's characters often experience profound loneliness and despair. Claudia, the child vampire from Interview with a Vampire, serves as a tragic example. Trapped in a child's body while her mind matures, she resents Lestat and Lewis for condemning her to eternal childhood. Similarly, the ancient vampires, such as Maharet and Akasha in The Queen of the Damned, 1988, demonstrate how age can bring not wisdom but alienation and a loss of connection to humanity. Through these characters, Rice illustrates that immortality is as much a burden as it is a gift. 4. Identity and transformation. Throughout the series, identity is fluid. Lestat, originally depicted as a villain, evolves into a more nuanced character, while Lewis remains stagnant in his grief and guilt. Other vampires, such as Armand and Marius, undergo transformations shaped by their experiences and historical contexts. Gender and sexuality are also explored in unconventional ways. Rice's vampires transcend traditional human gender roles, experiencing attraction and love beyond societal constraints. Their relationships defy labels, reflecting a broader commentary on identity and self-expression. Cultural impact and legacy. Rice's work had a profound impact on both vampire literature and popular culture. Before the Vampire Chronicles, vampires were often relegated to the horror genre, but Rice's novels popularized them as protagonists of dark fantasy and gothic romance. Her influence can be seen in modern vampire fiction. Authors like Charlaine Harris, True Blood, Stephenie Meyer, Twilight, and J.R. Ward, Black Dagger Brotherhood, owe much to Rice's reinvention of vampires as emotionally complex beings. Film and television adaptations. The 1994 film Interview with a Vampire, starring Tom Cruise and Brad Pitt, introduced Rice's vampires to a wider audience. More recently, the AMC television adaptation of Interview with the Vampire, 2022, reimagined the story for modern viewers. Gothic and alternative subcultures. Rice's aesthetic and thematic focus on Gothic romanticism, existential longing, and rebellion against societal norms resonated deeply with Gothic and alternative communities. LGBTQ+ representation. While never explicitly labeling her characters' orientations, Rice's vampires engage in deeply intimate, non-heteronormative relationships, making her work a touchstone for LGBTQ+ readers. A new kind of vampire. And Rice's The Vampire Chronicles, 1976 to 2003, redefined vampire fiction by crafting characters with rich inner lives, existential struggles, and profound moral dilemmas. Moving beyond mere horror, she infused Gothic fantasy with philosophy, psychology, and deep emotional resonance. By humanizing vampires and allowing them to question their nature, Rice transformed the genre, leaving an indelible mark on literature and popular culture. Her vampires are not merely blood-sucking monsters, they are poets, philosophers, and lost souls, searching for meaning in an immortal existence. This legacy endures, ensuring that the Vampire Chronicles remains one of the most influential works in modern Gothic literature. Universal's Dracula, 1931. Bela Lugosi, the definitive Dracula. 1. Lugosi's Hungarian origins and influence on his role. Bela Lugosi, born Bela Ferenc Dejú Blasco in Hungary, had a strong theatrical background before transitioning to film. His stage experience was vital in shaping his unique take on Dracula. Lugosi's naturally aristocratic demeanor and deep Hungarian accent were not initially Universal's first choice for the role. The studio had considered Lon Chaney for Dracula, but Chaney's untimely death in 1930 left the position open. Lugosi had previously played Dracula on stage in a 1927 Broadway production, which had already showcased his distinctive interpretation. His slow, deliberate speech, piercing gaze, and theatrical flair made him an unforgettable presence. Universal was hesitant to cast him at first, but after extensive lobbying and agreeing to a lower salary, Lugosi was finally given the part. His performance would go on to define Dracula for generations, influencing actors from Christopher Lee to Gary Oldman. 2. The signature accent and enigmatic delivery. One of Lugosi's most enduring contributions to the role is his heavily accented English, which became synonymous with Dracula. The phrase "I want to suck your blood," though never actually spoken in the film, became an exaggerated pop culture version of Lugosi's voice. His slow, deliberate manner of speaking added an otherworldly quality to Dracula, making the Count seem both sophisticated and unsettling. Unlike previous portrayals that emphasized the monstrous nature of the vampire, Lugosi imbued Dracula with a seductive, aristocratic charm. Lines such as, "Listen to them. Children of the night. What music they make," are delivered with an eerie, almost poetic quality, reinforcing the Count's mystique and power. 3. Refined mannerisms and hypnotic presence. Unlike the grotesque Nosferatu, 1922, which depicted Count Orlok as a rat-like creature, Lugosi's Dracula was suave, elegant, and hypnotic. He wore a black cape, formal evening wear, and exuded an eerie calm. His movements were slow and deliberate, creating a sense of supernatural control. Lugosi also made strategic use of his eyes, staring intensely at his victims to convey Dracula's hypnotic abilities. This deliberate, mesmerizing performance became a staple of vampire portrayals, seen later in Christopher Lee's Hammer horror films, Frank Langella's Dracula, 1979, and even in animated parodies like Count Von Count on Sesame Street. The film's cinematic impact. 1. Expressionist horror aesthetics. Despite being a Hollywood production, Dracula, 1931, was heavily influenced by German Expressionism, evident in its high-contrast lighting, looming shadows, and eerie set designs. This visual style helped emphasize Dracula's unnatural presence. Cinematographer Karl Freund, who had worked on Metropolis, 1927, employed dramatic lighting techniques, particularly close-ups on Lugosi's piercing stare, to enhance the film's gothic horror atmosphere. 2. A departure from the novel. While based on Bram Stoker's novel, Dracula, 1931, took creative liberties. The film omitted much of Stoker's intricate plot, simplifying the story for early talkie cinema. Some notable changes include: Renfield, Dwight Fry, originally a minor character, is given a much larger role as Dracula's crazed servant. Jonathan Harker's role is reduced, shifting focus onto Van Helsing's battle with Dracula. The film does not show Dracula's fangs or depict his bite directly, as censorship restrictions were still tight. Despite these differences, Dracula established a cinematic template that future vampire films would follow. Lugosi's Dracula vs. Later interpretations. 1. Christopher Lee's Savage Dracula. When Hammer Studios revived Dracula in the late 1950s, Christopher Lee played the Count in a far more animalistic and violent manner. Unlike Lugosi's slow, hypnotic approach, Lee's Dracula was physically imposing, more aggressive, and often depicted with red eyes and sharp fangs. While Lee's performance became iconic in its own right, it was Lugosi's aristocratic sophistication that remained the defining blueprint for Dracula. 2. Gary Oldman's romantic Dracula, 1992. Francis Ford Coppola's Bram Stoker's Dracula, 1992, returned to some elements of Stoker's novel while infusing a tragic, romantic depth into the character. Gary Oldman's Dracula has moments of Lugosi's elegance but is also far more emotionally complex. Still, even Oldman's portrayal borrows heavily from Lugosi's refined demeanor and hypnotic presence, particularly in his early scenes in Transylvania. 3. Dracula in pop culture. Lugosi's Dracula has been parodied, referenced, and celebrated countless times. Count Von Count, Sesame Street, is a direct homage, using Lugosi's accent and mannerisms. Hotel Transylvania, 2012, features Adam Sandler's Dracula, who adopts the famous accent. Even horror comedy films like Dracula, Dead and Loving It, 1995, playfully imitate Lugosi's performance. Bela Lugosi's legacy and final years. Despite defining the role of Dracula, Lugosi struggled to escape typecasting. He was often cast in low-budget horror films, unable to find major roles outside the vampire archetype. By the 1950s, Lugosi's career had declined significantly, and he struggled with financial and health problems. He ultimately passed away in 1956, buried in his Dracula cape, forever cementing his connection to the role. Even though later actors brought their own interpretations, Lugosi remains the definitive Dracula, and his influence on horror cinema is undeniable. The enduring power of Lugosi's Dracula. Universal's Dracula, 1931, set the standard for cinematic vampires, and Bela Lugosi's performance remains its most unforgettable element. His aristocratic charm, hypnotic presence, and haunting accent turned the character into a cultural icon. Without Lugosi's Dracula, the modern vampire genre, from Hammer Horror 2 and Rice's Interview with a Vampire, to today's pop culture depictions, would look very different. His legacy endures, proving that sometimes, true immortality is achieved not through fangs, but through film. Buffy the Vampire Slayer, 1997 to 2003. For 7 seasons, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, 1997 to 2003, transformed the landscape of television storytelling, blending horror, drama, humor, and action in a way that continues to resonate with audiences. At the heart of its mythology lay the reimagining of vampires, not only as monstrous villains but also as complex, tragic antiheroes. Through characters such as Angel, Spike, and Drusilla, the series redefined how vampires could be depicted on screen, balancing their supernatural horror with psychological depth and moral ambiguity. This essay explores Buffy the Vampire Slayer's portrayal of vampires, focusing on their dual role as both terrifying threats and nuanced, sometimes sympathetic figures. By analyzing key characters, themes, and the show's narrative approach, we will understand how Joss Whedon's series reshaped vampire lore for a new generation. Vampires as terrifying enemies. In Buffy the Vampire Slayer, vampires are the primary antagonists of the Slayer, with each season introducing new and increasingly dangerous foes. From mindless, bloodthirsty creatures to cunning masterminds, the series crafts a multifaceted vampire mythology that combines both classic horror tropes and fresh, subversive elements. The monstrous side of vampires. From the pilot episode, the series establishes vampires as a terrifying threat. Unlike the romanticized figures found in and Rice's The Vampire Chronicles or the brooding, misunderstood vampires of later pop culture, Buffy's vampires are, at their core, predators. The show envisions vampirism as a demonic possession, where a vampire is not merely a transformed human but rather a human corpse reanimated by an evil spirit. This perspective strips away the notion of their former humanity, making them ruthless, soulless killers. Physically, Buffy's vampires shift between their human and demonic visages, a key visual distinction. Their vamp face features ridged brows, yellow eyes, and elongated fangs, reinforcing their monstrous nature. This design choice underscores their duality. Vampires can blend into society when they wish, but their true form is something terrifying. Symbolism and horror. Whedon's vampires function as metaphors for real-world fears and challenges. The show frequently uses them to explore themes such as addiction, loss of control, and the darkness lurking within individuals. For instance, Jesse, one of Buffy's friends in the first episode, is turned into a vampire, illustrating how easily people can succumb to darkness. Another major theme is the loss of agency. When a human becomes a vampire, they are no longer themselves but a new entity altogether. This transformation serves as a metaphor for losing one's soul, whether to addiction, violence, or corruption. Throughout the series, vampires serve as a reminder that evil can take many forms, sometimes hiding behind familiar faces. Vampires as tragic antiheroes. Despite their often monstrous nature, some vampires in Buffy the Vampire Slayer transcend their traditional villainous roles, becoming tragic antiheroes. Angel, Spike, and even Dracula present a more layered approach to vampirism, blurring the lines between good and evil. Their personal struggles with morality, redemption, and love make them some of the show's most compelling characters. Angel, the cursed soul. Angel is the first vampire the audience encounters who breaks from the typical mold. Unlike other vampires, Angel has a soul, a curse placed upon him by gypsies as punishment for his past crimes. This curse forces him to experience guilt and remorse for the atrocities he committed as Angelus, one of the most feared vampires in history. Angel's journey is one of redemption. He struggles to atone for his past sins while also grappling with his vampiric nature. His relationship with Buffy is the emotional core of the show's first 3 seasons, embodying the classic star-crossed lovers trope. Buffy and Angel's romance is deeply tragic, as their love is constantly tested by his monstrous past and the ever-present danger of his curse. If Angel experiences a moment of pure happiness, he loses his soul, reverting back to Angelus, a sadistic and remorseless killer. This duality makes Angel one of Buffy's most compelling characters. He represents the idea that redemption is possible, but also that the past is inescapable. His internal conflict highlights the show's nuanced approach to morality. Can someone truly change, or are they forever defined by their past? Spike, the reluctant hero. If Angel is the show's tortured romantic hero, Spike is its rebellious rogue. Initially introduced as a ruthless villain in Season 2, Spike, William the Bloody, is one of the most feared vampires in history. Unlike Angelus, who revels in psychological torment, Spike thrives on the thrill of battle. His love for destruction is matched only by his devotion to his longtime lover, Dracula. What makes Spike unique, however, is his capacity for change. Unlike Angel, who is forced into redemption by his soul, Spike begins to evolve on his own terms. His love for Buffy, at first obsessive, later genuine, pushes him toward a path of transformation. His arc in Season 5 and beyond is one of self-discovery. He chooses to fight alongside Buffy and her friends, even while struggling with his darker instincts. Spike's journey reaches its climax when he actively seeks out his soul, believing that only with it can he become worthy of Buffy's love. This moment is pivotal because it proves that change is possible, even for a creature of darkness. Unlike Angel, who had his soul forced upon him, Spike chooses his own redemption. Spike's arc challenges the notion that morality is solely determined by external forces like a soul. Even as a soulless vampire, he demonstrates capacity for love and sacrifice, showing that true change comes from within. Dracula, the madness of immortality. Dracula is another fascinating vampire who blurs the line between monster and tragic figure. A psychic in her human life, Dracula was tormented and driven insane by Angelus before being turned into a vampire. Her story is one of extreme psychological torment. She retains her visions but is completely detached from reality. Unlike Angel and Spike, Dracula does not seek redemption, nor does she exhibit any moral conflict. However, her insanity makes her a tragic character. She is a product of Angelus's cruelty, embodying the long-term consequences of violence. Her presence in the series serves as a reminder that some vampires are irreparably broken, unable to choose a different path. Buffy's complex relationship with vampires. As the Slayer, Buffy is sworn to eliminate vampires, yet her most profound relationships are with them. Her love for Angel and Spike complicates her black-and-white view of good versus evil. Through these relationships, she grapples with larger questions. Can monsters be redeemed? Can love transcend fundamental differences? Buffy's evolving perspective on vampires mirrors the show's shifting narrative. Initially, she sees them as purely evil, but as she grows, she comes to understand their complexity. By the end of the series, she no longer views morality in absolute terms but instead recognizes that good and evil exist in shades of gray. Legacy and influence. Buffy's reimagining of vampires as both terrifying foes and tragic figures influenced countless works of fiction. Shows like Supernatural, The Vampire Diaries, and True Blood all draw from Buffy's blueprint, presenting vampires with both monstrous and human qualities. From shadowy monsters to charismatic antiheroes, the cinematic vampire has evolved, reflecting our fears, desires, and changing times. But one thing remains, our obsession with these creatures of the night. What's next for vampires in film? Will they return to their terrifying roots or continue their seductive reign? Let us know your favorite vampire movie in the comments. And if you enjoyed this deep dive, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell for more film history. Until next time, stay out of the dark, unless you're ready to meet what lurks within.